Hey everyone, before we get started, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so YouTube keeps sending you more spine-chilling stories like these. I was staring at the glowing screen of my monitor at 3 in the morning when I finally saw the winning notification for an auction I never should have entered. The cursor blinked rhythmically against the dark background of the browser, mocking me with the confirmation that I had just spent $500 in cryptocurrency on a mystery box from a seller known only as the Curator. I told myself it was just for the content of my channel, because people love watching someone else take risks, but as the page refreshed and displayed a digital map of my own neighborhood for a split second before vanishing, a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. The box arrived 3 days later, left not by a delivery truck, but appearing silently on my porch in the middle of a heavy rainstorm. It was wrapped in thick, black industrial plastic that smelled faintly of ozone and old copper. I brought it inside and set it on my desk, feeling a strange weight to it that didn't shift when I tilted the container. My hands were shaking slightly as I set up my camera and lights, thinking about the views this would get, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was opening a door that was meant to stay locked. Why did the seller refuse to provide a tracking number? And how did they know exactly which floorboards in my porch creaked the loudest when they dropped it off? As the blade of my knife sliced through the plastic, a heavy, metallic scent filled the room, making me cough. I reached inside and pulled out a smaller wooden crate, fastened with rusted nails that looked like they had been pulled from an old shipwreck. Inside the crate, nestled in mounds of shredded newspaper from the 1990s, was a collection of items that made my heart stop. There was a worn leather wallet containing a driver's license for a man who had been reported missing in the next town over 3 months ago. There was a set of silver keys on a ring, and as I picked them up, I realized with a jolt of pure electricity that they were identical to my own house keys, right down to the specific scratch on the brass from when I fumbled them last winter. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the only sound being the hum of my computer fan and the rain lashing against the glass. How could a stranger on an encrypted marketplace have a copy of my front door key? My mind raced through every possibility, wondering if I had been hacked, or if someone had been watching me from the shadows of the park across the street. Then, at the very bottom of the box, I found a small, cheap burner phone with a single unread message glowing on the screen. It said, "The live stream is starting now," and it included a link to a hidden Onion site. With trembling fingers, I typed the URL into my browser, and my blood turned to ice as the video feed loaded. It was a high-definition camera angle of a dark hallway, and it took me several seconds to realize I was looking at the corridor right outside my own bedroom door. The camera was positioned high in the corner, hidden behind the ventilation grate, and I could see myself sitting at my desk through the open door on the screen. I was watching myself watch the video. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I sat perfectly still, afraid that even a small movement would trigger whatever was waiting in the dark. Suddenly, a second window opened on the site, showing a chat room filled with hundreds of anonymous users betting on what I would do next. They weren't just watching a mystery box unboxing. They were watching a hunt. One user wrote that the intruder was already inside the crawl space, while another joked about how long it would take for me to notice the smell of gasoline. I felt a sudden, sharp draft from the hallway, even though all my windows were supposed to be shut tight. My eyes moved from the monitor to the actual doorway, where the shadows seemed to be lengthening and stretching toward me. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, a sound that echoed back to me through my computer speakers with a terrifying 2-second delay. I realized I couldn't call the police because the burner phone had disabled my local Wi-Fi, and my cell service had been jammed by a device somewhere in the room. I was completely isolated in a high-rise apartment, and someone was playing a game with my life for the entertainment of a digital crowd. I stepped into the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it might crack. Every shadow looked like a crouching figure, and every creak of the building sounded like a footstep. I reached the ventilation grate I had seen on the screen and smashed it open with the butt of my flashlight. A small, wireless pinhole camera fell out, its red light blinking like a dying eye. As I stared at it, I heard a soft, metallic click from the kitchen. It was the sound of a burner being turned on. I ran toward the kitchen, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and saw that the stove was indeed clicking, trying to ignite, while the smell of gas began to fill the air. Through the window that looked out onto the fire escape, I saw a gloved hand pulling the frame shut from the outside. The intruder wasn't trying to hide anymore. They wanted me to see them. I lunged for the door, but it had been jammed from the outside with a heavy steel bar. I was trapped in a ticking time bomb while a group of strangers online watched the countdown. I didn't have time to be afraid anymore. I had to move. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet and shattered the kitchen window, the glass exploding outward into the rainy night. I climbed out onto the slick metal of the fire escape just as a small spark from the stove ignited the accumulated gas, blowing the kitchen door off its hinges with a muffled roar. The force of the blast threw me against the railing, and I looked down to see a dark figure standing in the alleyway below, looking up at me. He wasn't running, he was just recording me with a phone. I realized then that I was the product, and as long as I was reacting, they were winning. I didn't go down the stairs toward him. Instead, I climbed up, reaching the roof of the building and jumping the gap to the neighboring rooftop, which was only a few feet away. I ran until my lungs burned and I found an open roof hatch in the next building. I burst into the hallway, screaming for help until a neighbor opened their door, phone in hand, already calling the authorities. The police never found the man in the alley, and the mystery box was incinerated in the fire, leaving no evidence of where it came from. The burner phone was found in the debris, but it had been remotely wiped of all data. I moved out of that city the next week and stopped uploading videos entirely. The email arrived in a new inbox I'd set up exclusively for my most obscure deep dive research, an account so buried in proxies and VPNs that I thought it was impenetrable. The subject line was chillingly simple. You have been nominated. No sender name, no body text, just that one phrase and a hyperlink to a domain ending in .onion. I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the trackpad of my laptop, feeling a peculiar mixture of dread and a morbid curiosity that always seemed to get me into trouble. I told myself it was for a new article I was writing about underground voting systems, but a cold dread told me otherwise. I clicked the link. The page that loaded was stark, black and white, with a simple title at the top, The Scales of Justice. Below it was a picture of me, a candid photo taken from across a coffee shop window, sipping a latte and looking at my phone. My heart immediately began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Underneath the picture was a progress bar, currently at 1%. Then, a chilling message: vote on whether this individual deserves to be removed from the system. Voting ends in 24 hours. A wave of nausea washed over me, the kind that makes your stomach feel hollow and your limbs heavy. I scrolled down, my eyes wide with disbelief, and saw a list of anonymous comments. Finally, a real target, one said. Too much social media presence. Get rid of him. Another offered, looks like an easy mark. His routine is clockwork. They knew me. They knew my face, my habits, my location, and they were openly discussing my potential demise as if I were a product on a shelf. A timer at the top of the page showed 23 hours, 59 minutes, and counting down. This wasn't some elaborate prank. It was a death warrant, crowdsourced and voted upon. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I remembered the photo, the level of detail in the comments. These weren't random internet trolls. These were people who had invested time and effort into observing me. What if the police were compromised? What if they were watching me now, waiting for me to make a move? The fear was paralyzing, trapping me in my apartment as the light outside slowly faded into the muted grays of a coming evening. I felt like every shadow held an eye. Every creak of the building was a step closer to my door. As night fell, I started seeing the votes ticking up slowly at first, then faster. 5%, 10%, 15%. Each percentage point felt like a physical blow, a tightening of the noose. The comments became more explicit, suggestions for how to remove me, where I might be found, what my weaknesses were. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a glass box in a digital zoo. I checked every lock, barricaded the doors with furniture, and pulled the blinds tightly shut, as if obscuring my physical space would somehow make me invisible to the digital mob. Around midnight, a new feature appeared on the page, a live map showing my general location within the city, but with a red dot slowly pulsing, indicating increased activity. Then came the messages in the comments section. I'm near his usual late-night coffee spot. Saw a light in his window, floor 3, left side. They were out there, in the literal shadows of my city, following the anonymous directions of the crowd. I could hear sirens in the distance, a common city sound, but tonight it sounded like a precursor, a warning. I knew I couldn't stay. The longer I remained in one place, the easier I would be to find. I had to become a ghost, blend into the city's vast network of anonymity, and try to disappear before the vote reached 100%. I packed a small bag with essentials, some cash, a change of clothes, and my burner phone. I left my laptop running, the voting page still open, a macabre scoreboard of my impending doom. I quietly slipped out of my apartment, making sure to double lock the door behind me, knowing it wouldn't offer much protection if they really wanted in. The city at night was a different beast. Every person I passed seemed to glance at me for a beat too long. Every car that slowed down made my heart leap into my throat. I tried to blend in, walking quickly but not running, keeping my head down, avoiding eye contact. I could feel the cold gaze of the internet on my back, the collective anticipation of hundreds, maybe thousands of strangers. I found a quiet, unassuming 24-hour diner and ordered a coffee, just to have a place to sit and try to plan my next move. I pulled out my burner phone and checked the site again. The vote was at 68%. There was also a new chat thread, live sightings. Someone had reported seeing me at a diner downtown. Panic flared, hot and sharp, in my chest. I hadn't even been there for 10 minutes. They had eyes everywhere. I looked around the diner, my gaze sweeping over the late-night patrons, trying to discern who might be part of the hunt. A man in a corner booth, hunched over his phone, suddenly looked up and met my gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. I quickly paid and slipped out the back door, into a dark alleyway. I decided my only chance was to lose myself in the busiest parts of the city, where one face was just another in a sea of millions. I headed for the central train station, hoping to catch a late-night regional train. Any train that would take me far away from this concrete jungle. The station was a cacophony of noise and movement, a perfect place to disappear. As I bought a ticket with cash, I saw a notification on my burner phone. The vote was at 85%. And then a new message on the site. The watchers are converging at the main station. I looked up from my phone, and my eyes met those of a woman across the bustling concourse. She was holding her phone up, clearly recording, and then she subtly pointed in my direction. Panic gave way to a surge of adrenaline. I bolted, pushing through the crowds, heading for the nearest platform. I heard shouts behind me, indistinct at first, then growing clearer. That's him, the one in the gray jacket. They were calling me out publicly. The game was reaching its terrifying climax. I sprinted onto a train just as the doors began to close, squeezing through the narrow gap before they sealed shut. I dove into the nearest seat, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the platform through the window. I saw two figures, both holding phones, staring intently at my carriage, their faces unreadable masks in the station lights. As the train slowly pulled away, their images receded, and I slumped back into my seat, utterly drained. The vote never reached 100%. The site went offline an hour later, swallowed back into the dark web's endless depths. I spent the rest of the night on that train, riding it to the end of the line, then immediately buying another ticket back in the opposite direction, just to put more distance and time between me and whatever twisted game they had been playing. I changed my name, moved to a different country, and erased every trace of my online existence. I was lurking on a deep web mirror of an old data leak forum, the kind of place where hackers dump gigabytes of stolen emails just to prove they can, when I found a file that didn't belong. It was titled with a random string of numbers and letters, tucked away inside a folder labeled as boring tax documents from a defunct logistics company. Most people would have scrolled right past it, but I've always been drawn to the things that people try the hardest to hide. I clicked the download button, watching the slow progress bar as the encrypted packet transferred to my local drive, unaware that every byte was a nail being driven into the coffin of my peaceful life. When the file finally decrypted, it wasn't a document at all, but a shaky, high-definition video that looked like it had been recorded on a high-end body camera. The footage started in a dimly lit, industrial basement where three men in expensive suits were standing over a large, open crate. They weren't talking, but their body language was frantic, almost desperate, as they began to pull out bricks of what looked like raw, uncut emeralds. Then, the camera panned slightly to the left, and my heart stopped. There was a fourth man on the floor, bound and gagged, wearing the uniform of a high-ranking federal agent. One of the men in suits pulled a suppressed pistol and, without a single word of hesitation, fired twice. I sat back in my chair, the air in my small hotel room feeling suddenly thin and cold. I was traveling for work, staying in a generic chain hotel on the outskirts of the city, thinking I was completely anonymous. I had just witnessed an execution involving people who clearly had the resources to kill a federal officer and keep it out of the news cycle. I checked the metadata of the video, and my blood ran cold when I saw the timestamp. The recording had been created less than 4 hours ago, and the GPS coordinates embedded in the file were less than 10 miles from where I was currently sitting. I tried to close the browser, but the screen flickered and a command prompt window popped up, scrolling lines of code faster than I could read. Someone was backtracing my connection. I had used 3 different layers of encryption, but whoever was on the other end was slicing through them like they weren't even there. A message appeared in the center of my screen, written in plain, white text. "We see you, witness. Do not leave the room." I didn't wait. I grabbed my laptop, jammed it into my backpack, and lunged for the door, my pulse thundering in my ears like a drum. I peered through the peephole and saw the long, carpeted hallway of the 3rd floor. It was empty, the flickering fluorescent lights casting long, sickly shadows against the wallpaper. I stepped out and sprinted toward the stairwell, avoiding the elevator because I knew they could easily trap me between floors. As I pushed through the heavy fire door, I heard the distant, muffled sound of a black SUV screeching to a halt in the parking lot directly below. I raced down the stairs, my shoes slapping against the concrete steps, the sound echoing upward and making me feel like I was being chased by my own shadow. When I reached the ground floor, I didn't go through the lobby. I knew the front desk clerk would be the first person they would ask. Instead, I slipped into the narrow service corridor that led to the laundry rooms and the back exit where the dumpsters were kept. The smell of industrial detergent and hot steam was overwhelming, making it hard to think straight as I searched for a way out. I reached the heavy steel back door and cracked it open just an inch. 2 men in dark tactical jackets were stepping out of a vehicle, their eyes scanning the windows of the hotel. They didn't look like police. They looked like professionals who were paid to make problems go away. One of them held a tablet, likely tracking the hardware ID of my laptop, which was still pulsing out a signal I couldn't figure out how to kill. I realized with a jolt of terror that as long as I carried that bag, I was wearing a digital bullseye. I turned back into the laundry room, looking for anything to buy me time. There was a large, industrial-sized rolling bin filled with dirty linens. I shoved my backpack deep into the bottom of the bin, buried under layers of wet towels and bedsheets, and then I pushed the bin toward the far corner of the room. I stripped off my bright red hoodie, revealing a plain white t-shirt underneath, and grabbed a discarded janitor's cap from a hook on the wall. It was a thin disguise, but in the dark, I hoped it would be enough to break their visual profile of me. I exited through a different side door that led toward the dark woods behind the hotel property. I didn't run this time. I walked with a steady, purposeful pace, mimicking the movement of a tired worker ending a long shift. I could see the flashlights of the men cutting through the darkness of the parking lot, their beams dancing across the brickwork of the building I had just escaped. I reached the tree line and melted into the shadows, the cold dampness of the forest floor soaking into my socks. I watched from the safety of the brush as the men entered the hotel through the back door I had just used. Minutes later, the lights in my third-floor room flickered on. I could see their silhouettes moving against the curtains, searching the bed, the closet, the bathroom. They were efficient, silent, and deadly. When they didn't find me, one of them walked to the window and looked out into the woods, his flashlight beam cutting a long path through the trees, missing me by only a few yards. I crawled deeper into the undergrowth, moving as silently as a predator, until I reached a drainage pipe that ran under the main road. I squeezed inside, the smell of stagnant water and old iron filling my nose, and I waited. I waited for hours, listening to the sound of cars passing overhead, wondering if every engine belonged to someone hunting me. My phone was dead, my laptop was gone, and I had no way of knowing if that video was still out there or if I was the only person left who knew the truth. When the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, I emerged from the pipe, covered in mud and shivering from the cold. I walked 3 miles to a small gas station in the next town and used a payphone to call a number I had memorized years ago, a cousin who worked in federal records. I didn't tell him everything. I just told him I was in trouble and needed a ride to a safe house. I never went back for my laptop, and I never saw that video again. A week later, I saw a small blurb in a national newspaper about a tragic accident involving a federal agent whose car had gone off a bridge in a different state. There was no mention of emeralds, no mention of an execution, and no mention of the men in the suits. I realized then that the dark web isn't just a place for hackers and criminals. It's a window into a world that operates right alongside our own, hidden in plain sight. I live in a different city now under a name that isn't mine, and I never, ever click on a file I don't recognize.